In the village of Umuagbola, there was once a man named Nnamdi. He was the wealthiest person in the village, living in a grand mansion with his beautiful wife, Ngozi. People in the village admired Nnamdi. They called him a successful man, someone everyone should look up to. But despite his wealth, Nnamdi had one big problem: pride. Nnamdi never visited his mother, Mama Uzio, who lived on the outskirts of the village in a small, humble cottage. She was old, kind-hearted, and lived simply. But Nnamdi didn't care. He was too busy with his riches and his fancy life with Ngozi. He always thought he was too important to visit his mother. One day, Ngozi, who was beautiful but jealous, came up with a plan. She wanted to make Nnamdi believe that Mama Uzio was against their marriage. "Your mother is speaking badly about me," Ngozi said to Nnamdi, her voice full of anger. "She wants to bring shame upon our family and take away everything you've worked for." Nnamdi, always trusting his wife, was quickly filled with rage. "How dare she?" he thought. "No one insults me or my wife." His anger grew, and with a determined heart, he decided to confront his mother. Without a second thought, Nnamdi rushed to Mama Uzio's cottage. His mind was clouded with anger, and he couldn't see clearly. He reached the cottage, bursting through the door like a storm. "Mama Uzio!" Nnamdi shouted, his voice shaking the walls. "How could you tell such lies about my wife? You are plotting against me, aren't you?" Mama Uzio looked up, her eyes full of confusion. She had no idea what he was talking about. "My son, I have said nothing bad about your wife," she replied softly. "Why would I do such a thing?" But Nnamdi was too blinded by Ngozi's lies. His anger took over, and before Mama Uzio could say anything more, he raised his hand. With all his strength, he slapped her across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the village. Mama Uzio fell to the ground, her body shaking with shock and pain. The villagers who saw what had happened were stunned. They whispered among themselves, but no one dared to step in. Nnamdi stood there, breathing heavily, his face filled with rage. But as he looked down at his mother, who lay on the ground, crying softly, something inside him started to shift. But his pride stopped him from feeling any real regret. He turned away from her, his heart hard as a rock. Mama Uzio slowly picked herself up, tears streaming down her face. Her heart was broken, not just from the slap, but from the pain of seeing her own son so angry at her. "Nnamdi," she said, her voice soft but filled with sorrow, "you will lose everything. Your wealth will fade away, and you will be left alone. All that you have will disappear, and you will regret what you have done." As she spoke, the wind began to howl. The sky darkened, and the air grew cold. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the entire village seemed to tremble under the weight of her words. It was a curse born from her heartbreak and sorrow. But Nnamdi, too proud to believe in such things, stormed out of the cottage. He didn't care. He didn't need his mother's forgiveness. He was too focused on the lies he had been told. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. Nnamdi's once thriving business started to fail. His wealth, which had seemed endless, began to vanish. The mansion that had once stood tall and proud began to crumble. The fine furniture was left broken, the beautiful gardens overgrown with weeds. The people who once praised him now avoided him, whispering behind his back. Ngozi, seeing that her husband's luck had turned, was quick to abandon him. "You bring bad luck," she told him, packing her things and leaving the mansion. She took everything, every last piece of wealth. Nnamdi was left alone in the house that had once been filled with luxury. Now, it was nothing more than a cold, empty shell. Desperate and ashamed, Nnamdi wandered the village, but no one respected him anymore. The villagers who had once feared him now laughed at his misfortune. Nnamdi could no longer stand to be around them. But worse, he could not bring himself to go back to his mother. His pride wouldn't let him. he still believed she was the reason for his fall. That night, Nnamdi sat alone in the dark ruins of his mansion. The walls that had once held his riches now seemed like the walls of his shame. His heart ached with regret, but his pride still held him back. He knew he had done something terrible, but he couldn't admit it. He couldn't bring himself to beg his mother for forgiveness. The mansion was silent, except for the sound of Nnamdi's heavy breathing. His world had fallen apart, but his pride kept him trapped in a cage of his own making. The fall from the heights of wealth to the depth of loneliness was harder than he could have ever imagined. Yet, there he was, alone in the darkness, regretting everything but too proud to fix it. That night, as Nnamdi slept in the cold, empty mansion, something incredible happened. In his dream, he saw a glowing figure, a magnificent angel standing before him. The angel's light was so bright that it seemed to fill the entire room. Nnamdi was both terrified and mesmerized. The angel's voice echoed through his soul, powerful and calm. It spoke words that Nnamdi would never forget. Nnamdi, the path to your redemption lies in humility. Seek your mother's forgiveness, and you will regain your wealth and honor. Nnamdi woke up with a start. His body was covered in cold sweat, and his heart raced. The silence of his once grand mansion now felt deafening. The reality of his life hit him harder than ever. He had lost everything. His wealth, his wife, his dignity, all gone. And the only thing standing in his way of returning to his mother was his pride. The angel's words echoed in his mind, but his heart was torn. Could he really go back and ask for forgiveness after what he had done? As the morning sun began to rise, Nnamdi sat in the stillness, deep in thought. The weight of his pride felt like a heavy chain around his heart. He had to go to his mother. But how could he? His pride made it feel impossible. But in the depths of his heart, he knew he had no choice. The next day, Nnamdi made the difficult decision to visit Mama Yuzo. His heart was heavy with guilt and shame. His feet felt as though they were stuck in thick mud, unwilling to carry him forward. The villagers stared as he walked through the streets. Some whispered behind their hands, while others looked at him with pity. But Nnamdi kept his head low, unable to face anyone. Finally, he arrived at his mother's humble cottage. His body trembled as he stood outside. The memories of what he had done, the slap, the harsh words, flooded his mind. The shame weighed heavily on him. But then, he took a deep breath and walked inside. Mama Yuzo was sitting by the window, knitting quietly, as though she had been waiting for him. The moment Nnamdi laid eyes on her, everything changed. His pride shattered like glass. He could no longer stand tall or hide behind the man he used to be. He fell to his knees in front of her, tears streaming down his face. "Mother, I am sorry. I let the lies of my wife blind me. Please forgive me." His voice broke as he spoke, full of regret. Mama Yuzo gazed at him for a long moment, her face softening. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she placed her hand gently on his head, as a mother would comfort a child. After a pause, she spoke quietly, but her words were full of wisdom and love. "My son, I have forgiven you. But remember, humility is the key to true worth. Never let pride or lies steal your peace again." The moment she spoke, something incredible happened. The sun, which had been hidden behind clouds, broke through, shining down on them both. It was as if the heavens themselves were rejoicing. Nnamdi felt warmth fill his heart, and for the first time in many years, he felt at peace. His heart was no longer heavy with anger or regret. He had finally found forgiveness. As Nnamdi left his mother's home, something miraculous began to happen. His fortunes slowly started to turn around. People who had once avoided him now came to him with respect. His old business partners reached out, offering him opportunities. Slowly, his wealth began to return, not in the same way it once was, but in a new, more meaningful way. The material riches were no longer his only focus. Instead, he found that the true wealth was in the relationships he built, the respect he earned, and the humility he embraced. Nnamdi's character had been reborn. He learned that true prosperity didn't lie in gold or luxury, but in love, honor, and humility. His heart had been cleansed, and now, he walked with a new sense of purpose. Nnamdi returned to the village, but he was no longer the arrogant man he had once been. He had become a wise and respected leader, known not for his wealth, but for his kindness and humility. He visited Mama Yuzo often, always remembering the lesson that had saved him. He had learned that no matter how far someone falls, true humility could lead them to redemption. The villagers noticed the change in him. They saw a man who had humbled himself and learned from his mistakes. Nnamdi became a living example of redemption, showing that no matter how deep one falls, there's always a way back up if one has the courage to seek forgiveness and change.